Back in the day, your choices for weekend transportation were limited. Oh, sure, if you lived in Alexandria, you could afford a chariot ride or a horse. But for most people, if you wanted to get somewhere, you walked. That is, unless you lived near water, in which case you took a boat. Boats are convenient, right? Well, that depends. If your boat was the equivalent of today's luxury yachts, life was probably pretty sweet. Sure, you may have spent half your life savings on a single vessel, but you'd also probably live in a society that valued your safety. Since anyone foolish enough to set out to sea without investing in proper craftsmanship likely didn't last long. We know this because when we find wrecks from these elite builders, they tend to be found in one piece. However, the vast majority of boats were far more humble affairs, built from whatever materials were available by whoever had need of one. And those vessels frequently broke apart. Today, we're talking about the story of one such boat, a replica of which sits here in the shop, and how its original owners ended up at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Hi, I am here to give you a behind-the-scenes look at what goes on at a museum of science and industry. Like I said, our boat is a replica. The original was discovered by a group of archaeologists. In 1970, they found it in pieces along the southern shore of the lake, buried in the muck. Our boat is a reconstruction based on that discovery, done in 1980 for an exhibit in the museum's coal and steel gallery. This boat is believed to be a barge, possibly used to transport limestone from Drummond Island to the mills of northern Michigan in the late 1800s. In addition to the planks of wood you see here, the team found oakum matting, nails, a broken pump, and some cargo that looks suspiciously like lime, making their hypothesis all the more compelling. It was built in the same way as most boats of its era, with planks fastened over a frame with nails. It's called carvel construction, and it was pretty common. But the exact way this particular vessel was built has long been lost to history. No written records tell us exactly how these boats were put together, so we're left with trial and error. To replicate this boat, our curators relied on everything from historical pictures to artistic renderings to their own imaginations. As they wrote in the exhibit's program, how these parts went together will never be known. Each craftsman had his own ideas and methods, and there was no standardization, but they did have educated guesses. Since we know that rivets were used in the bottoms of boats during this time period, our team assumed that the upper works were joined in a similar fashion. They consulted with naval architects who helped them calculate the necessary angle for each plank S intersection with the keel and other structural members. Then they brazed and cut the pieces to fit. They also estimated the thickness of the planks, calculating that 3/4 of an inch would be strong enough to withstand the rigors of sailing. They drew lines on the planks to show where they should be cut. Finally, they used a combination of copper and steel nails to hold the whole thing together. It was painstaking work, and I mean really painstaking. When you take a look at the details, you can see that none of these boards line up perfectly. The edges don't form crisp 90s. Instead, the lines all converge toward the center of the boat. The nails aren't countersink. They stick out, creating raised bumps across the surface. The boards themselves are uneven. This isn't a perfect replica of the original boat, nor is it intended to be. It's a representation of the kind of workmanship that would have gone into a barge like this. Back in the day, the tools used to build boats weren't exactly precise. Hand saws were used with files to smooth out the planks, but they didn't produce straight cuts. You can imagine that if you had a long row of planks and a picture of a boat to guide you, you'd start laying them out, cut by cut, and by the end of the day you'd end up with something that looked just like this. In fact, given the imperfect nature of the original material, it's a bit strange that it would have worked as well as it did. After all, the first Europeans to explore the Great Lakes did so in dugout canoes, and the wooden boats of the time were frequently just as leaky as they were unstable. Building a boat was one thing, but getting it to stay afloat was quite another. To keep the water out, builders employed several tactics. The first was to make sure the planks overlapped properly. Notice here how the edge of one plank extends beyond the next, creating a lip that the water can't slip under. Next, they filled the seams between the planks with oakum, a thick hemp or flax tow that's twisted and shoved into the cracks. Lastly, they used wooden plugs to reinforce the planks where the nails passed through. Still, all this work didn't guarantee success. While the average person may think of a boat as being like a bucket or a bathtub designed to hold water inside, early boat builders thought of them more like a bucket or a colander designed to keep water out. Early boats leaked. It was just a fact of life. They took on water all the time. Pumps had to be installed in the lowest points of the hull to keep it from sinking. In fact, pumps were so important that people who sailed the lakes came to be known as pump men. Unfortunately, pumps were unreliable. Even on calm days, it was difficult to keep them primed. And when storms struck, well, forget about it. Things would rapidly fill with water. You could bail and bail, but every time you did, more would come pouring in. Leaks also threatened the cargo. Imagine storing barrels of flour, salt, or fish in a boat that was taking on water. By the time your goods arrived at their destination, they'd likely be ruined. But now that we've seen how this boat was built, let's talk about some of the things that could go wrong. When boats were built, planks were fastened to the frame using either nails or spikes. It was faster and cheaper to use nails, but spikes stayed in place better. We're pretty sure that's what happened here because we found both types on board. Spikes were usually heated before they were hammered into place to help seal the hole that they were made in the plank. But the process was still a gamble. You couldn't simply slam them into the wood without risking splitting it. Here you can see how a spike is supposed to fit into a plank. It's supposed to go in easily, holding the two halves of the split together. But when you look at this close-up of the replica, you can see that it's more like a boule in a china shop. The edges are splintered and torn. The hole wasn't clean. Why? Because this boat wasn't actually built to be a replica. It was built to be an exhibit, and the builders didn't want to split the planks apart. Instead, they added extra support so they could use a hammer without ruining the display. In other words, this nail isn't a historically accurate representation of the boat's construction, but rather an artifact of its preservation. Regardless of whether spikes or nails were used, once the planks were in place, builders covered them with paint to stop leaks. But that too was a challenge. Painters needed to apply the coating fast before the wood swelled from water contact and warped the planks. They'd mix up a paste made from boiled linseed oil and ground bones, then slather it on top of the hull. The idea was that the soft wood would absorb the coating and expand, filling the pores and preventing water from seeping in. It was called deadwood, and it was notoriously unpleasant to work with, but the alternative was worse. Without it, boats would be constantly leaking, creaking, and deteriorating. Unfortunately, this system had its drawbacks. Bones and sawdust are somewhat flammable, and when the boat had to be caulked, workers had to heat up the hull to soften the coating. This made them vulnerable to spontaneous combustion, and if that wasn't bad enough, the fumes from the coating were dangerous to breathe. Caulking was equally unpleasant. Most coatings were too thick to spread easily, so workers would have to heat them up and thin them with spirits or turpentine. Then they'd apply it with brushes made of hog's hair. The smell was horrendous. Workers would often pass out from breathing it in, and some even burned to death when the vapors ignited. Clearly, building a boat wasn't easy. It required skill, strength, and some luck. None of these ships would have stayed afloat for long without competent sailors at the helm. To learn more about the explorers who sailed the Great Lakes, check out the related content. It's fascinating. The very first ships were invented around 6000 BC in Mesopotamia. What a time to be alive. However, the Mesopotamians never got too far offshore. Their empire sat between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, so their boats stayed on the freshwater. No worries, though, because soon after the next great civilizations took to the seas. The Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Austronesians, they were so good at sailing that they explored the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the Pacific Islands. And those guys didn't have Google Maps or GPS. They navigated using the stars, currents, and most importantly, really good charts. But before they set sail, they had to build their ships. And that was a very dangerous job. You see, shipbuilding is hard. Just ask any modern shipbuilder. We're now 4 generations into this family business, and I'm here to tell you it's a lot more than hammering nails into some driftwood. Shipbuilding requires math, geometry, engineering, physics, knowledge of your local forests, and loads of patience. But ancient builders somehow learned all of this by trial and error. They observed the natural world, tested different designs, and consulted old books. These skills got passed down through generations, helping each new builder become a little better than the last. Unfortunately, they were still pretty bad. So, in today's video, we're going to look at 5 reasons why ancient ships were cursed. From the get-go, and don't worry, we'll be back. Next week, we're going to learn how they sailed these death traps across the ocean. First problem, the hull from hell. The hull is the part of the ship that floats. Or at least it's supposed to. But in ancient times, shipbuilders often relied on trial and error rather than blueprints or scientific testing. In ancient Greece, for example, even the mighty triremes, those famous warships with 3 decks of rowers, had to be built to exact proportions. If the hull was even slightly misaligned, the whole thing became a lumbering, unstable raft that couldn't steer properly. And when mistakes were discovered? It was usually after the ship had already been launched with 20 to 100 terrified men aboard. Second problem, wood is alive. Remember that perfect oak tree you cut down 3 months ago? Yeah, it's still alive. Wood continues to warp, expand, and shrink long after it's been chopped down. This was especially brutal in regions with harsh weather like Scandinavia, where temperature changes made planks swell or crack unexpectedly. Imagine building a ship in summer only to watch it fall apart at the first sign of winter. Ancient builders tried to season the wood, but impatient rulers or warlords rarely gave them the time. And green wood? That was the devil. It warped unpredictably and sometimes caused entire ships to lean sideways before launch. Some shipyards even added rituals or blessings to calm the spirit of the wood. Not that it worked. Third problem. The cursed launch day. Launch day was meant to be a celebration. But for shipbuilders, it was the most stressful moment in the entire process. One mistake, and months of work would be reduced to a floating coffin or worse, an immobile log sculpture. The ship had to slide off the wooden scaffolding and enter the water gracefully, which almost never happened. Too steep, and the ship would smash into the water, cracking its own hull. Too shallow, and it would get stuck halfway, refusing to budge like a sulking child. Workers would then have to shove it manually using logs, levers, and an endless supply of curses. Many injuries happened during launches, as giant logs rolled the wrong way or the ship suddenly tilted. And let's not forget, if the ship launched sideways or crooked, it could capsize right then and there. Instant failure. Fourth problem, rope, sails, and hope. Let's assume your ship hasn't exploded yet. Well done, but guess what? Now you've got to make it move. Ancient ships were powered either by oars or sails or both. And making a sail from linen, hemp, or wool was a project of its own. Sails tore easily, soaked up water like a sponge, and often had to be patched mid-journey. Ropes were another weak link. Made from plant fibers or leather, they rotted quickly, especially in sea air. If a key rope snapped during a storm, the sail could collapse or worse, spin wildly and capsize the ship. Ancient shipbuilders tried everything from soaking ropes in oil to using animal guts. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't, and the oars? Each one had to be hand-carved, balanced, and strong enough to withstand hours of rowing. If even one oarlock cracked, it could throw off the whole rhythm and steer the ship in circles. Fifth problem. The human factor. We haven't even mentioned the passengers yet. Most ships were crewed by peasants, slaves, or low-ranking soldiers, none of whom were trained sailors. That meant they didn't know how to distribute weight properly, how to repair leaks, or what to do if something went wrong. Shipbuilders often added ballast to help with balance. But if the crew didn't understand how to use it, the ship could list dangerously to one side or capsize in rough waves. Some builders started adding illustrated instructions carved into the hull. Do not stand here. Tie this rope. Don't poop off the left side. When it all went wrong, despite all precautions, many ancient ships never made it past their first voyage. Archaeological evidence shows dozens of ancient shipwrecks within just a few kilometers of shore. One Roman vessel, discovered near Italy, sank because of overloaded cargo and a weak keel, something the shipwright probably warned about, but was ignored. Another Greek merchant ship was found with its bow cracked inwards, likely from a bad launch. The crew never even made it out of the bay. In ancient Egypt, there are records of entire fleets being lost to the sea god, which probably means built too quickly and full of holes. So yes, ancient shipbuilders were geniuses. But they also had to be miracle workers, fortune tellers, and occasionally scapegoats, and when things went wrong, they were the ones blamed. Now, to be fair, the ancient builders did have some advantages that we wouldn't expect today. For example, back then, it was okay to use trees as big as houses as ship parts. There weren't that many of those around, so we're grateful for the free market economy that brought us affordable lumber, steel girders, and competent engineers. Well, maybe not those last two. Anyway, in part 3, we're gone ahead to sea with these wooden marvels and explore just how terrifying it was to actually sail in something handmade by a guy who hadn't slept in a week. Click here to get a sneak peek at life on board an ancient ship, and thanks for watching. I've been your host, and I'll see you next time. Whoa. Did you think we were done? Of course we're not done. We've still got 3 more videos to go. First, check out part 2 of this series to learn why ancient ships were nightmares. Then take a journey through time with our video on ancient Egyptian trade ships. Finally, dive into the story of the Mary Rose, a Tudor warship that sank in 1545 and remained hidden until 1971. Trust me, you won't want to miss any of these amazing adventures. So click away and happy exploring. In 2015, archaeologists found a shipwreck off the coast of Syria. To get to it, divers had to plunge 230 feet deep. The oxygen was thin, the visibility even thinner, and the current was strong enough to snatch a human off the seabed. But once they reached the bottom, they saw this: rows and rows of coins preserved perfectly on the sand. And after painstakingly collecting them, experts realized this was no common cargo. Every coin told the story of a civilization. Each one was minted between 66 and 63 BC by the armies of Pompey the Great. It was history in hand. And it also made this wreck one of the richest archaeological finds of the last decade. Hey there. It's me. And let's take a closer look at this sunken treasure trove because it touches on all the worst nightmares of any ancient shipbuilder. First, the ship itself. Divers haven't lifted it, not even the coins. It's buried too deeply. It's way too cold, and they don't even know what kind of ship it is. Second, how it sank. We know nothing about the crew, passengers, or cargo. Was it a raid? Did the ship strike a reef? Was the hull rotten? And third, how it stayed intact for 2,000 years. Shipwrecks decompose fast. Animals feast on the wreckage. Currents scatter the debris. Storms toss the remains onto shore. But somehow this ship remained undisturbed, intact, and immaculately preserved. Of course, we still have a lot to learn from the wreck. Experts will study the coin's engravings to learn more about life under Pompey's rule. But they may never know how this vessel met its end. Why? Because the truth is, we don't really know much about ancient shipping, especially since wood doesn't preserve well underwater. Most of our knowledge comes from written records. But those are biased, incomplete, and usually focused on big trade ships or warships. Our understanding of daily life at sea is limited, to say the least. So buckle up, historians and adventurers alike, as we dive into the fascinating, terrifying world of ancient shipbuilding. The ultimate test: the Atlantic crossing. Many modern shipyards build luxury yachts, oil tankers, maybe a warship or two. But when they finish a new vessel, they test it first. They send it out to sea for a trial run, usually in calm waters, then slightly rougher waters, then really rough waters. They check the stability, durability, and performance of the hull, the engines, the entire ship. How did ancient builders do this? It's simple, really. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean. That's right. The first recorded Atlantic crossing was in the year 1492. Christopher Columbus sailed west from Europe with 3 ships and an insane theory. He believed the Earth was smaller than everyone thought, and if he sailed far enough west, he'd reach Asia. Spoiler alert, he didn't, landing instead in the Bahamas. But still, that was an epic test for his ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nita, and luckily, all three survived. Well, sort of. The Santa Maria ran aground in a storm and became a total loss. But the other two returned to Spain with enough gold to make everyone rich and change history forever. Of course, we don't know how good or bad those ships really were. The Atlantic has calmed down quite a bit since 1492, and not even Columbus finished the trip without a fight. But it does show how builders tested their products. They put them to the ultimate test, hoping for the best and bracing for disaster. The Colossus of Rhodes, Colossus of Greece, Colossus of Engineering. Yep, the ancient world had some pretty big egos. Nowhere is this more obvious than the Colossus of Rhodes, a gigantic statue of the Greek god Helios that stood at the entrance to the harbor of Rhodes. It was 110 feet tall, built around 280 BC, and one of the ancient world's 7 wonders. But it only stood for 56 years. Then a series of earthquakes struck the island. The Colossus crumpled, fell, and stayed broken for 1,600 years. And yet this monstrosity of bronze and marble attracts millions of visitors to Rhodes every year. Why? Because while it may have been an ego trip for the Rhodians, it's also a lesson in shipbuilding. See, the Colossus had a secret. Its legs were hollow. Inside each thigh was a giant pillar topped with a flat roof. Mariners could climb the stairs, rest, and look out across the sea. In effect, the Colossus was an observation tower, giving sailors a landmark to navigate by. The deeper meaning behind the hubristic statue was this: the people of Rhodes believed they had the skills to build anything. But behind that belief were years of trial and error, countless ships, and generations of shipbuilders working toward perfection. Sure, many of those ships went down with leaks, cracks, and the occasional sea monster, but the lessons learned from their failures contributed to the glory of their successes. Here's a toast to all the ancient shipbuilders who tried, failed, learned, and created. The black shipbuilding kings, while many of us take to the seas for leisure, war, and trade, kings took to the seas to conquer and control. And in ancient times, the most powerful weapon of all was your navy. Whoever controlled the seas controlled the world. Just ask the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, and the Aztecs. All of them built huge navies and fought deadly naval battles. But none of them could have done it without skilled shipbuilders. King Solomon, legendary king of Israel, supposedly built a fleet of seafaring vessels to trade with his buddy, King Hiram of Tyre. Legend says they ventured into the mysterious land of Punt, possibly modern Somalia or Tanzania, and returned with exotic goods like gold, spices, and rare animals. But that was thousands of years before Christopher Columbus. What were the builders of Solomon's fleet using for navigation? Well, sadly, we don't know. The Bible only hints at the skills and crafts involved in building ships. Many of the world's great shipbuilding nations were ruled by monarchs who demanded massive fleets of warships and trading vessels. The biggest of them all was the Ottoman Empire. By the 17th century, the Ottomans had thousands of ships of the line, capable of carrying 200 cannons each. When they went to war against European powers, these black ships dominated the seas. With unbreakable hulls and gunpowder-packed firepower, the Ottoman Navy was a legend. But in 1683, a Venetian bomb ignited the powder magazine of the flagship, the Sultan's wife. The explosion killed 2,000 crewmen and ushered the Ottomans into decline. Another shipbuilding dynasty was China's Song dynasty. From 960 to 1279 AD, Chinese junks explored more of the world than any other navy, traveling from the Korean peninsula to Africa. For centuries, these massive ships were the workhorses of trade, carrying silk, porcelain, spices, and ideas across the globe. But after the Song dynasty fell, China turned inward, collapsing its navy and shuttering its shipyards. Sometimes royal ambition could literally blow up in your face. The worst maritime disaster in history happened in 1682, when King Louis XIV of France commissioned the Soleil Royal, a massive warship with a 120-foot gun on the bowsprit. It was the largest cannon in the world, but it was also horribly unstable. When the king fired it to celebrate Easter, the whole ship exploded. Nearly 1,000 sailors died along with King Louis's son, the Dauphin. But even disasters like this weren't always enough to stop shipbuilding. As we'll see in Part 4, the desire to explore the unknown often overcame the fear of explosive fatalities. Ancient shipping. Business as usual. If you visited a port city in ancient times, you would have seen dozens of ships coming and going. You might have spotted a junk from China, a galley from Rome, a cog from Northern Europe, or a bireme from Greece. But you wouldn't have noticed that each of those vessels was handmade, designed, and crafted by a single shipbuilder. That's right. Unlike today's mega shipyards, most ancient ships were built by a single craftsman or small team. They drew the plans, cut the planks, fitted the joints, caulked the seams, painted the hull, and launched the ship. Only then would the true test begin. When ships came in from a voyage, the builder would be waiting with a team of carpenters. If the hull was damaged, they would repair it immediately. That meant the same shipbuilder was responsible for the design, construction, maintenance, and repair of every vessel in port. That's a tough gig, especially considering the dangers of the job. Shipbuilders risked cuts, bruises, broken bones, drowning, and sometimes death. Imagine the frustration of crafting a ship for years, seeing it sail away for weeks, then watching it come back in pieces. On top of that, shipbuilders were frequently exploited, cheated, and robbed. It was hard to claim copyright in ancient times, and shipbuilders' innovations were often stolen. And if the ship sank or capsized or brought shame to the owner, the builder got the blame. So we should all raise a glass to ancient shipbuilders, the original jacks of all trades. To watch the whole series, click the link above. You've heard us talk about how life as an ancient shipbuilder was pretty tough. While modern shipyards have fancy computers, laser-guided equipment, and even robot welders to help build ships, our ancestors were doing this with nothing but brute strength and keen minds. It was hard, dangerous work that required a special kind of person, one who was up for the challenge. But building ships in the modern era is still a tough job, especially when you consider the insane specifications some rulers had for their vessels. When an order comes down from on high, shipbuilders didn't just have to meet demand, they had to blow past expectations or face stiff penalties. But what happened when they did fail? How much destruction could they cause? Today, we're looking at the tales of disaster from history's most intense shipbuilders. When King Sejong the Great of the Korean kingdom of Goryeo first heard about the Chinese junk, he was impressed. The large ocean-faring vessel sounded perfect for his kingdom's needs, capable of traveling long distances on the open seas. King Sejong commissioned several Korean versions of the Chinese junk, but it soon became apparent that the country's shipbuilders lacked experience in such a complex vessel. They had mostly built medium-sized ships before. So the king decided to bring in the expert, a man named Wan Kaku, who had built many Chinese junks over his career. Wan Kaku's reputation preceded him, and the king welcomed him with open arms, giving him everything he needed to construct the most magnificent junk Korea had ever seen. But there was a hitch. The king gave Wan Kaku a tight deadline, 6 months to have the ship ready for a voyage to China. Unfortunately, the weather delayed construction, and it soon became clear that the ship wouldn't be completed in time. Worried about the impending scolding from the king, Wan Kaku came up with a solution. He would launch the unfinished ship. Yep, you heard that right, launch it. No rigging, no masts, no finishing touches, just the bare hull hitting the water. Despite the protests of his assistants, Wan Kaku stuck to his guns. He even got the king to come inspect the progress personally. And when the king saw the impressive hull gliding through the water, he was satisfied. Well, almost. As the ship floated toward the dock, the king noticed something, the name written on the stern of the ship. It read, "The great ship cannot be finished in 6 months." Clearly, Wan Kaku had gotten a bit sassy with his defiance. The king wasn't pleased, but instead of punishing Wan Kaku, he gave him a promotion. Wan Kaku spent the rest of his life working in the kingdom's navy, probably having learned to keep his opinions to himself. A shipbuilder has so many parts to focus on that sometimes the obvious can be overlooked. Take the great French frigate Le Hermione, which was built to recreate the ship that carried Marquis de Lafayette to America during the Revolutionary War. The ship was meant to be a symbol of friendship between France and the United States. So the French took extra care in its construction. It was built with sturdy materials and painstaking attention to detail. But in the rush to get the ship completed in time for the bicentennial of Lafayette's voyage, one crucial part was neglected: the steering mechanism. The Hermione set sail from France in 2015 to the United States. But once it arrived, it became clear that the ship was basically useless without a way to control its movement. The U.S. Coast Guard refused to allow it to dock until it was fixed, forcing the crew to sail the ship back to France where they made the necessary repairs. Once completed, the Hermione was finally able to dock in New York City in August of 2018, 3 years after it left France. Hopefully, it stayed there longer than its predecessor. If you thought you had a bad boss, try working for someone who literally had you locked up while you work. That was the fate of the shipbuilders working for the Chinese eunuch official Wang Jin. Wang oversaw the construction of a huge naval fleet for the Chinese Emperor Hongzhi, including 2 giant treasure ships. Yep, the real-life inspiration for Minecraft's iconic ship. Each treasure ship measured 91 meters long, 13 meters wide, and stood 4 stories tall. It had 5 masts and required a crew of over 1,000 to operate. Construction of the fleet lasted from 1483 to 1497, a full 14 years of Wang Jin being in charge. And he kept his workers motivated with fear. He had everyone involved in the construction locked up in a compound near the shipyard. He also stationed guards at every entrance and exit. Workers were allowed out only 1 hour per day to stretch their legs. If anyone was caught trying to escape, their punishment was brutal. Wang had them sewn up in leather sacks along with their family members and thrown into the sea. In 1607, the Virginia Company of London sent 144 men to establish the first permanent English settlement in North America. They chose the location now known as Jamestown, Virginia, but the following winter things didn't go well. Supplies were low and the colony suffered from starvation and disease. Only 35 of the original settlers survived. The following year, a new group of 500 settlers arrived, bringing supplies that saved the colony. But that meant that the second year, the colonists had food and resources. So why are they always called the starving settlers? Because the second group was made up entirely of indentured servants who were effectively enslaved for 7 years. By the end of the decade, the Virginia colony was stable, but only thanks to the introduction of a new cash crop, tobacco. Unfortunately, tobacco was incredibly labor-intensive to grow. So, to ensure that the colony continued to thrive, the Virginia Company brought in the first African slaves to North America to work the fields. It's a common sight these days, someone walking along the pier and falling in. But you know what's rarer? Someone building a ship and falling in. Yet that's exactly what happened to George Stetson, an Alaskan boat builder who was attempting to create a replica of a World War II-era landing ship. While working on the project in a Seattle dry dock, a section of the ship tilted, causing Sisson and his apprentice to fall into the water below. Luckily, the pair was wearing life jackets and managed to surface, but then they realized they were trapped. The 2 men were wedged between the dock and the ship's hull and couldn't get themselves free. Rescuers attempted to pull them out, but they were too big for the space. So firefighters had to cut away sections of the ship to free them. Eventually, they were rescued and taken to the hospital suffering from hypothermia, but they survived. It's one thing to lose a ship at sea, but it's another thing entirely to lose it before it hits the water. Ask Henry VIII and his advisors. When the king decided he wanted to start a war with the rest of Europe, his counselors knew he'd need a big fleet of ships, but England's navy wasn't quite up to snuff. So they hired 2 of the best shipbuilders in the country, John and Thomas Custis, to design and build the ships. The Custis brothers designed and built 4 warships, but the 3rd ship they started construction on never saw the light of day. Instead, it exploded. An accidental fire erupted in the ship's magazine, killing 8 shipbuilders and injuring 19 more. To top it off, the explosion shook the entire town, causing 22 homes to collapse. John Custis went on to design many more ships for the king, but he never forgot the disaster that could have been avoided if Henry had just waited a few more weeks to declare war. Ancient shipbuilders didn't have modern tools or techniques. All they had was grit and determination. But that didn't mean they were reckless. They understood the consequences of a failed construction project. If you want to learn more about how they crafted their masterpieces, check out our video on how ancient shipbuilders used riveting to create ocean-going vessels. We dive deep into the techniques they used and how it compares to other methods today. You might even learn a thing or two. The human race has been building ships nearly as long as we've been walking upright. We may have started out hacking spears from flint and making rafts from reeds, but somewhere along the line we learned how to take those materials and bend them to our will. We discovered the secret to harnessing raw natural resources and turning them into vessels capable of traversing the greatest obstacle on Earth, the ocean. In doing so, we reshaped the world. So far, we've slogged through the swamps of ancient shipyards, wrestled with cursed planks, sailed into storms on leaky death traps, and survived tyrants demanding floating fortresses. Now, in this final part, it's time to ask, was it worth it? The answer isn't simple. Ancient shipbuilders were rarely honored, often overworked, and usually forgotten. But without them, civilization wouldn't have spread, empires wouldn't have risen. The world, as we know it, might still be a series of isolated coastlines and riverbanks. This is the story of how their blood, calluses, and uncelebrated brilliance changed history. Floating cities and lost wonders, let's start with the masterpieces. A few ships survived long enough to become legends. Think of the Khufu ship, a full-size solar bark buried near the Great Pyramid of Giza, made of 1,200 individual pieces of wood, painstakingly assembled without a single nail. It was never meant to sail, yet its construction shows how seriously the Egyptians took their shipwrights. Then there's the Viking longship, which changed the game. With its flexible hull, shallow draft, and astonishing speed, it let Norse warriors raid, trade, and settle as far as Baghdad in North America, and guess what? It was held together by wooden pegs and muscle memory. Ancient Chinese treasure ships are another marvel. Though few physical remains survive, written records describe floating palaces with 9 masts, hundreds of crew, and room for exotic animals. Some modern shipbuilders still argue over whether they were real or myth, but the sheer possibility speaks to the ambition and burden of the builders behind them. These weren't just tools, they were symbols of ambition, of fear, of control over nature. And every nail, plank, and sail tells a story of a builder no one bothered to name. Sunken sacrifices. The archaeological graveyard, while a few ships lived on as relics or royal barges, most ended up at the bottom of the sea. That's where archaeologists found the evidence of shipbuilders' brilliance and their struggles. Take the Aluburan wreck found off the coast of Turkey. Dated to around 1300 BCE, it carried luxury goods, ivory, gold, glass, spices, weapons. The craftsmanship of the hull-cedar planks, pegged mortise and tenon joints, carefully balanced ballast speaks of deep experience. But it still sank. Why? Maybe a storm, maybe bad loading, we'll never know. But one thing's clear, someone built it with care, and someone paid the price when it failed. The Antikythera wreck also tells a story of lost genius. It was carrying delicate machinery, marble statues, and luxury cargo on a ship built to handle it all, and yet it too met the seafloor. Each wreck is a tragic reminder. Building the ship was just the beginning. Every one of them had a team of men who built it plank by plank, then watched helplessly as nature or man brought it down. Knowledge passed in splinters, you might expect that such a high-stakes profession would result in books, scrolls, or engineering manuals. But ancient shipbuilders left very few written records. Most of their knowledge was passed down by word of mouth, demonstration, and repetition. Why? Because literacy was often reserved for priests and elites. The shipbuilders were craftspeople valued, yes, but not seen as scholars. That means entire traditions vanished with the men who practiced them. We don't know how Egyptian shipbuilders calculated balance. We don't know how the Vikings aligned their hulls so perfectly without a measuring tape. We don't know how Chinese builders kept enormous hulls watertight using only wooden dowels. What we do have are ruins, timber fragments, tool marks, burned beams. and a few stunningly preserved hulls that whisper, "We knew what we were doing." Even if no one cared enough to write our names. Unsung brains behind global change, let's be clear, shipbuilders built the ancient world, literally. Without them, the Phoenicians wouldn't have crossed the Mediterranean, spreading their alphabet. The Greeks couldn't have colonized distant coasts, spread their ideas, or fought at sea. The Romans couldn't have supplied their legions or held their empire together. The Vikings wouldn't have reached new lands or terrorized old ones. The Chinese couldn't have projected power into the Indian Ocean or influenced distant kingdoms. These weren't just boats. They were weapons, lifelines, myths, and monuments. And every single one was made by someone who knew, deep down, that the sea didn't care how much work they'd put in. The legacy lives on today. Shipbuilding is digital. Steel replaces timber. Robots do the heavy lifting. But walk into a modern shipyard, and you'll still find echoes of the past. There are men and women working overtime, cursing under their breath, sweating over measurements, staring at the sea, wondering if their creation will hold together once it leaves land. Ancient shipbuilders didn't vanish. They evolved. Their spirit lives in every fishing trawler, every cargo ship, every Navy destroyer. The scale is different, the materials have changed, but the task is the same. Take something unnatural and make it float. Then pray it holds. Final thoughts. The invisible builders of civilization, we remember the captains, the conquerors, the kings who pointed at the horizon and said, "Go there." But we forget the men who made the going possible. They were not poets, not saints, not rich, but they were thinkers, problem solvers, craftsmen who stared at trees and saw possibility, who didn't just fight nature, they bent it to their will, into vessels that danced on the waves, raiding, trading, conquering, carrying wonders across the world. They worked in silence, died in obscurity, but their legacy, it sails on. So the next time you see a ship, remember, before it ever touched water, someone bled for it. Someone gave their back, calluses, and dreams to build it. They may not have known where it was going, but they knew how to send it on its way. And thank goodness for that. That's all for today. See you next time.